Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sustainapreneur Podcast, episode 20, where today we're going to be talking with Dr. Bradley Layton about how landfill-free business is possible in today's world. He's the CEO of Integration Energy, LLC, a published author, and an authority on zero waste. You're not going to want to miss this one, so stick around. Welcome back to another episode of Sustainapreneur Podcast, where we are bridging the gap between business and sustainability. We want to educate and motivate sustainapreneurs by discussing important topics, debating different perspectives, and by showcasing those of you out there who are doing it right now. I'm your host, Nate Hansen, and we're glad to have you with us. So let's get started. Hello, Brad. Glad to have you on the show.
Hey, Nathan. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So first, I'm going to go over just a short list of your many accomplishments so that our sustainapreneurs out there can get to know you better. Dr. Bradley Layton holds a degree in mechanical engineering from MIT and biomedical engineering from the University of Michigan. He's held faculty positions at Drexel University and the University of Montana. He's also the founder of Human Powered Future, PLLC, as a licensed professional engineer, and is the CEO of Integration Energy, LLC. His second book, Zero Waste in the Last Best Place, was published in December, where he discusses best practices for landfill-free living. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Probably among other things, too.
Probably a lot of things. Here we go.
So I guess the first question that should be asked is, how'd you get started into landfill-free living?
Well, like I say in my book, Nathan, there was a bright summer day up in the Rattlesnake Valley here in Missoula, where I live, where I was walking outside with a fairly modest bag of garbage. It was mainly things that had come from the bathroom. And I walked out to the curb because I didn't yet have a garbage can like most of my neighbors. And I went to toss this, bag that might have weighed 3 or 4 pounds into the back of the garbage truck. And I got a little wagging finger shaken at me from the garbage man. He's like, "No, you're not a paying customer. You're not a subscriber," which kind of puzzled me because everywhere else I'd lived, it was just part of city taxes, and the city owned the landfill, if you will. So I then learned that the landfill was privately owned, and that I was not compelled to be a subscriber. So I thought, well, gosh, my trash or waste is so small, I will unsubscribe and go off the landfill entirely. So that was kind of my one moment where I realized it was possible.
So what was the next step after that then?
Sure. Well, I'd already been composting. So if you go and look at some of the statistics on what goes into the landfills, it varies from state to state, but it can be as low as 5 or 10%, or as high as 20 to 40% of the matter that goes into landfills is either food or yard waste, things that you can just compost in your backyard and make soil from. So I was already doing that. I was even helping my neighbors compost. So as you might know, when you're composting, bigger is usually better. It's nice to have a nice big compost because then it gets hot, kills any pathogens in there, and gets to the soil phase quicker than otherwise would if you just had a small cold pile. So I already had that going. I also had chickens. Being here in Missoula, it's kind of fun to raise chickens. Most of the neighbors are usually pretty understanding about that. So the chickens would take care of a lot of the conventional kitchen waste that we had, take care of that, and give us eggs. And I also got to know a lot of the practices here in Missoula about recycling. So there are a few places here in town where you can take your aluminum, take your cardboard, in some cases take your plastics, and get a little bit of money for it. So I thought, well, instead of paying, it turns out to be about $1 a day to have my garbage and recyclables driven across town and put in a landfill indefinitely. I said, well, maybe I'll save that $1 per day and actually gain a little bit of income from it.
Yeah, and then also do something good for the environment and for society, and fight back a little bit against the landfill, right? Kind of idea?
Yeah, I guess I've always been someone that swum upstream, if you will. I ride my bicycle, and whenever I can, I'll, as the name of my company, Human Powered Future, implies, use my own body, muscle, strength to do things that a lot of times we rely on machines for. So frequently I would actually bicycle my recyclables to various locations around town, or sometimes even just share them with my neighbor. So if my neighbor was going to the recycling center, I would just give her, for example, the metals, and then she would use that money for her son's dentistry, for example. So it really was a community and a neighborhood effort in a lot of ways.
And I'd imagine that probably helps you connect a little bit with your neighbors too.
It does. And I think a lot of them said, okay, what's this quirky guy doing? Oh, well, he's just recycling. It's not, perhaps not as crazy as he seems at first. And there was a neat article that came out a couple years ago in the Missoula Valley Lifestyles magazine, where someone came up and took a few pictures. So we showed the sorting bench there in the garage, which I think you've seen before, and showed a gate that I'd made to get to my backyard out of lumber that my neighbor had discarded. He was done building his fence. We had all these odd shapes of wood, and I thought, well, gosh, that's just going to be, landfilled or something. Why don't I challenge myself and take that and do what's called upcycling? So, for example, I was not, allowing those materials to, go to waste, go to the landfill, or simply be discarded elsewhere. I tried to make something beautiful and creative with it, and that's another way to go zero waste that you'll see sometimes.
It's probably another way that you could, turn it into a business, is find a good, reputable, or a constant source of some kind of a diversion from the landfill and be able to turn it into something. I mean, I don't know if you could probably turn a whole lot into a whole lot of gates, but so I sit here and I look at you with all of your education and all of your background and all of your accomplishments. I can imagine that landfill-free was just something you decided to do and it was pretty easy to do.
Well, no, I don't do easy. I don't like easy. Yeah, I've never. I've frequently, when my office mates, for example, would see me, collecting the coffee grounds or the, say, the towel papers from the bathroom, they would say, well, Brad, what's going on? It's much easier just to put that in the garbage. Well, no, I don't do easy. It was the same thing with my father. He saw this gate and goes, wouldn't it just have been easier to cut all those boards the same length? Well, yes, it would have, but that's not typically my MO, if you will. So, and so for me, I think, though, Nathan, moving forward, I tend to take the long view of things. And so a lot of my formal training has been looking at sort of things like protein evolution. So when you mentioned my PhD in biomedical engineering, I was looking at, where did specific proteins in our genome come from? Where did the molecules that make us up come from? And if you go back far enough, you realize that everything in our bodies, everything on this planet actually came from the waste or an explosion from a supernova. And we talked a little bit about, the first law of thermodynamics. And so, we just have a finite number of titanium atoms on the planet, a finite number of iron, a finite amount of oxygen, et cetera, unless you're doing high energy physics, that's what we have to work with. So the philosophy became, well, gosh, if we went all the trouble of digging this aluminum out of the ground, of digging this copper up, of digging the lead, why would we just put it back in the landfill? So I've tried to take that view and realize that here in the U.S., we're quite fortunate in that we have a very low population density compared to other countries. And so a lot of other, so you look at Europe, you look at parts of Asia where the population density has grown, to be quite substantial. And they've gone through periods that Jared Diamond talks about in his book Collapse, where they really have exhausted the natural resources, Easter Island being a very good example. So if you're going through these natural resources faster than nature can replace them, then you're in trouble. So I've always tried to take the very long view on conservation, even right down, I guess, as I just mentioned, to the molecular or atomic level. So no, it's not easy, but right. I think that's something that we've witnessed other societies, countries, civilizations suffer through in the past, and I believe that if we are to become a sustainable global civilization, then we really will need to take the long view, as I mentioned, cosmologically, planetarily, but also a very small view of like, what are all those little elements and atoms that we're putting away into the landfill that could be put to better use.
So here on Sustainapreneur, a lot of times we try to relate sustainability with business. Mm-hmm. And now you started a company called Human Powered Future.
Right.
What stemmed that? What made
Sure.
you? Yeah.
Yeah. So I started Human Powered Future. I had inklings of it when I was moving from the East Coast to Montana in 2010, and a big part of that was looking really from an engineering perspective at energy consumption. So as an engineer, we're required to put things into numbers. And so the big thing for me was writing down, okay, so I understand the first law of thermodynamics, I understand the second law, I understand what it takes to run a household, from the electricity, from the natural gas, if you will. I also understand as a mechanical engineer what it takes to run an automobile, how much gasoline it takes, miles per gallon, et cetera, et cetera. So I sat down with that and said, well, gosh, if I'm just riding my bicycle, I'm moving along at my 10, 20 miles an hour with maybe a fifth of a horsepower or a quarter of a horsepower, very modest amount of power, versus someone who's sitting in their car to achieve the same goal of just getting your body and maybe some groceries or something from point A to point B with roughly 30 to 100 times the amount of energy. So imagine, if you will, putting your automobile or your truck onto a sleigh of bicycles, how many bicycles it would take to do that. So Human Powered Future was founded mainly on a energy efficiency basis. And from there, I also wrote a paper in 2008 called Energy Densities of Prevalent Energy Sources. So I said, well, gosh, why don't we just electrify our transportation grid? Why can't we just move away from fossil fuels? And as it turns out, the energy density in those fossil fuels is so great and so efficient in so many ways, versus, dragging around a tank of hydrogen with you, or running a long extension cord to your car, or things like that. So, from a physical basis, it became quite evident that the energy density of fossil fuels sort of trumped the power density of just human power. But there are numerous examples of ancient civilizations that did great things without the use of the steam engine or combustion engine. So I wanted to sort of dig into the fundamentals of that with Human Powered Future.
Right. It was kind of like those ancient civilizations. They invented things. Obviously they didn't have fossil fuels or steam engines, so they had to make do with what they had, and they were very creative. And then all of a sudden, we came up with fossil fuels. We started digging into the ground, but we didn't have to really worry in most Western civilizations of what we were destroying at the time. And now with the internet, with the ability for us to communicate on such a level playing field now across the world, I think that we're becoming educated to the point where we're realizing now, hey, we still have to have an economy. Like in America, we're a capitalist society. That's just the way it is. That's not going to change anytime soon. And so on Sustainapreneur, a lot of our listeners, our Sustainapreneurs, know that you need to use the system that we have now in order to create a sustainable future. And that's why we come and talk to guys like you.
Yeah.
We need to know how to do it from a scientific aspect, not just the business aspect.
Yeah. And there's a lot. And you mentioned, what society's going to look like. There, when I was my last few years there in Philadelphia, I actually had this thing called a pedicab. So it was a cab, painted like a checker cab that you would pedal. It had a little bit of a battery assist, nothing fancy. The whole vehicle maybe weighed 300 or 400 pounds. And I thought, well, gosh, maybe I'll do a little social experiment and see, if I were to replace, again, the combustion-driven cab with a, kind of a, fancy version of a rickshaw, if you will, how would I do? And so I spent a day just, pedaling this thing around Philadelphia. And of course, I was not quite fast enough to keep up with traffic. So I was probably causing more fuel emissions from people, stopping and accelerating to get around me, that I was saving in my little cab. And one particular fare, this woman hopped in, and I said, where are you heading? She gave me the address, and I was listening to her doing currency exchange internationally. So she was trading dollars for Japanese yen all the way to the destination. And we finally got there, and she goes, well, how much do I owe you? And I said, well, whatever you feel like. This is kind of an experiment. What was that ride worth to you? And I didn't have a meter running, and I know she paid me about half of what it would have cost a taxi cab. And then she looked down, and after she got off her phone, she's like, oh my goodness, I hope you weren't peddling this thing. That's just savage, So there's a lot of societal barriers to overcome too. But nevertheless, as you said, we are quite blessed and fortunate to have had the wealth of fossil fuels and natural resources that we've had. And just following up on the 2008 paper that I mentioned, there was another paper that just recently came out in 2015 by an author called Shramsky out of Georgia, and they looked at global energy reserves, and they took a look, and these are things I've written about too, is how does our rate of extraction of natural resources compare to the rate of deposition? As we know, we can't go and invent new carbon or invent new uranium or titanium. But what we are doing is changing the chemistry. So we'll take the long, rich hydrocarbon bonds and break them. And as we know, the only way to put them back together is through photosynthesis. We don't have a sort of a natural way to recreate those. Only nature has an efficient way of doing that. So again, that was a big reason for starting Human Powered Future. And as I just mentioned with Human Powered Future, the economics can get pretty skewed unless the true value of energy is understood. So
that's true.
Yeah.
So with integration energy, how did that stem?
Yeah.
What sparked that?
Yeah. So that came out of my position. I was formerly the director of the Energy Technology program at Missoula College. So that started in 2008. There were some faculty that were awarded a grant, a couple grants. One was through the Department of Energy, and the second one was through the Montana Department of Commerce. And there was a very forward-thinking dean at Missoula College at the time. His name was Paul Williamson. And this was, like I said, again, back in the 2000s. And he had become acquainted with the Hondas, with the Toyotas, even with the Schwarzeneggers. And at the time, there was this inkling or a shift towards the so-called hydrogen economy. So if you look at the hydrogen economy, it's one where, you can get combustion from using hydrogen and oxygen. In fact, a lot of the early Apollo rockets use that. It's also been proposed as a fuel for the surface of Mars. If you remember watching The Martian, that's how Matt Damon's character ended up making energy, etc. So
I love that movie.
Yeah, so hydrogen's everywhere, and it's a good energy source. But then there's the negative repercussions of the Hindenburg and things like that, where if it's not handled properly. So I inherited that legacy from Paul Williamson, and along with a lot of equipment, some of which was hydrogen. We have wind turbines, we have solar panels, we have a very strong biomass instructor in Brian Kearns, who partnered with Paul Williamson to write a lot of these grants. So throughout that, I really had the opportunity to educate myself, learning about all these different technologies, geothermal, solar thermal, etc., even energy storage. So throughout the course of my tenure there at the University of Montana, I was introduced, or a lot of people approached me who were in the renewable energy industry. So as you're probably aware, there is no one silver bullet energy, renewable energy solution. People say, well, Brad, what's the best renewable? Is it solar? Is it wind? Well, the answer is all of the above.
It depends. Greatest answer in the world.
It depends. Like, you're not going to have a coal-fired automobile, and you're not, or natural gas-fired automobile, and you're not going to burn gasoline in your fireplace. So there's,
At least, please don't.
Please don't. So just as there are, appropriate uses for fossil fuels, there are, appropriate and sort of best time of use for renewables. So I got to know a lot of people working in these various fields. So Integration Energy, I founded with 4 other business partners, and I built it on what I like to call the 4 F's. So I call it food, fuel, fertilizer, and fusion. So as you know, everyone needs food. No secret there. We've been talking about fuel a lot. So we need fuel to heat our homes, move our cars, power the grid, etc. We also need fertilizer. We need fertile soils. And unfortunately, there's so much erosion now. We talked a little bit about sustainability of fossil fuel. There's so much erosion. The rate at which topsoils are being lost to the ocean is also much greater than nature builds it, just through natural deposition rates. And then the 4th F is fusion. I just call it fusion because I need an F, but it's solar power, basically. And you look back to Edison, he said, I want to bet my money on the sun. If I had to bet my money on something, I'll bet it on the sun. So with those 4 F's in mind, I have 4 business partners, one of whom is focusing now on what organic crops can be grown in Montana. And there are several examples of that, of people that want to do the right thing with their land, but don't necessarily want to go with the corn, the wheat, etc., the conventionals. And so that's the fuel division, and then, that's the food division. And then on the fuel side, as I'm sure you're aware, there are so many forest fires in Montana, and a lot of times there's a struggle between the conservation groups and the logging groups, et cetera, to actually do sustainable forestry. So, and I think even this morning on the news, I heard some good news about, hey, we really do need to reduce some of the fuels in these forests before they go up like a giant tinderbox and take all the wildlife out and actually burn the soil. I mean, there's places where it gets so hot that you lose soil instead of gaining it from the decaying materials. So we have a process whereby we can take unwanted or hazardous biofuels, and you'll see them when you drive around to some of these forestry projects. They're just big burn piles, they're slash piles. You'll even see them on some fall days or some spring days when it's sufficiently wet outside to see these controlled burns. Well, why not take that and make electricity with it instead of a big smelly pile? So we've got a neat technology for combining unwanted waste wood fiber with unwanted hydrocarbons. In this case, it would be your number 2s and number 4 plastics, and burning those at a high enough temperature, just like you would in a coal-fired power plant, right, where really your only emissions are water and carbon dioxide. So that's the fuel side. And then the other 2 I mentioned were fertilizer. And for us, fertilizer doesn't mean something like the Haber-Bosch, where you're going and using fossil fuels to drive a petroleum-derived fertilizer. Instead, you're using carbon itself. So if you go back to the Midwest and you see these rich black soils, they're so rich and black because there's carbon in there. It's like
9 feet of it.
9 feet of it, like you expect to see.
Beautiful soil.
Yeah,
we don't get that out here in the Rocky Mountains.
No, and so there's so many opportunities to take that again, a portion of that unwanted wood fiber and turn it into a substance called biochar, and it's a little like charcoal, but slightly more special in that it preserves the structure of the wood, and on top of that structure, you can put in other natural fertilizers, like some people will use bat guano or worm castings or just plain old compost, or there's all of this fish waste every year that goes back into Flathead Lake. So some type of organic material. And another nice thing about the biochar is it retains water a lot better than just regular old soil would. So now you don't have the big runoffs and the pollution from the NPK that you see in the bodies of water that are causing problems now.
So let me get this straight. You're talking about pyrolysis, right?
It is. Pyrolysis is the way to go from wood fiber to the biochar. Exactly. Yep. Sure.
Because You know, in Montana, you hear a lot about save the trees. That's sustainable, right?
Of course, yeah.
Right. But there's another side of that.
Yeah.
You know, everything's up for question, right? We, for so long, said forest fires are bad.
Yeah.
And we need to fight forest fires so that it doesn't look ugly.
Right.
Right? And then, lo and behold, we find out that while we've been fighting fires, this is nature's way of cleansing all of the debris out. And now we have such a buildup of fuel that when a fire does finally burn through, it burns so hot, it sterilizes the ground, kills all the seeds, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And so save the trees, I believe, you know, that's a good idea. But, you know, we can't go so far in one direction that it also all of a sudden becomes an imbalance again.
That's right. That's right.
And so, you know, a lot of different ideas have come up of how we can solve this. Do we just let a forest fire burn through now? You know, you could do that, but it still has the problem of sterilizing the ground. Do we leave it alone and say humanity shouldn't get involved again because every time we do, we screw something up?
Right.
But I think there's a lot of science behind the idea of pulling some of this deadfall out, chipping it up, mixing it up, turning it into pyrolysis. There's a lot of science in pyrolysis. And instead of just blowing it out as a smokestack, you can turn it, you can recreate it into a fuel that burns itself, and then nothing but good, clean air comes out of the top.
Right. And then a lot of the char or the product can go right back on the soil floor. So you're sort of, you know, assisting Mother Nature, if you will, with that process.
So that's the fertilizer. So the byproduct is a fertilizer because that's carbon?
That's right. Yeah, it's almost pure carbon. And it's a special form, you know, in the same way that, you know, diamonds are a special form or graphite is a special form. It's a special microarchitecture of carbon that allows this you know, these nice soils to build. Yeah, absolutely.
So integration energy is really trying to cover a lot of these different things.
We are. And then the fourth F that I also mentioned, I just call it fusion. And so, if we are to achieve this, you know, true sustainability, we need to do it through 100% renewable energy. And there are several organizations out there that do that. Another good number to keep in mind is that about 1 hour's worth of sunlight hitting planet Earth is enough to power our civilization for an entire year. It's a 10,000 to 1 ratio. So a lot of people say, oh, there's energy scarcity and there's not enough energy. Well, no, there's plenty of sunlight. It's a 10,000 to 1 ratio. To some people that might sound like a lot. Some people say, whoa, it's not very much. We better hurry up and get after it. But, you know, as it turns out, you know, used properly, either with solar or wind, and even hydro. You know, most people don't think of it, but hydropower is really harnessing the sun because the sun evaporates the water, forms rain, that comes back down, you know, from the clouds. So, you know, most of the renewables, you know, ultimately are driven by the sun. Even, you know, wave. You know, a few examples of things that are not that are renewables that are not driven by the sun. One is geothermal. You know, that's typically from either just the you know, the original temperature of the earth cooling, or sometime from friction of earthquakes, believe it or not. And then, of course, the tidal energy is not driven by the sun. That's driven by gravity. But, you know, of course, biomass itself is solar derived. You know, the trees are out there growing and making more of themselves all the time. So that's my fusion part of
I don't know. It depends on how far down the rabbit hole you really want to go with this. Right. I mean, really, if you want to consider the debate, Earth is here because of the sun, and we rotate around that big fireball, and the whole reason why we have a core that is magma. So, big rabbit hole, right?
Yep. Well, I'm happy to go as far down as you like. I've been there before.
Yeah, let's see. How much time do we have? Yeah, we're fine.
Okay.
But so, out of all of these different, you know, tiers that you guys are focusing on, which ones have you found that are the most, I guess, lucrative?
Sure.
Which ones are you focusing on first?
Yeah. Well, what we have been able to do in the past year, we've closed a few deals on solar. So we've done a few residences here in town. We're also right now working on the food bank. So as you probably know, the food bank is a nonprofit here in town that helps feed a lot of families that have fallen on financial hardship. And
yeah, they just built that new building, didn't they?
Beautiful new building.
Yeah.
And they want to be sustainable. They want to do the right thing. So we're working on working with some of their funding agencies along with Northwestern Energy. So we're writing a little grant. Northwestern Energy does provide some funding for renewable energy development. So we'll be doing that with the food bank. We're also working with, if you look around, there are a lot of big industrial buildings in town that have unused roof space. So you start to think, gosh, how could we not waste that roof space? Kind of getting back to the zero waste theme. Don't let the sun just bounce off of that metal roof. Put some solar panels on it. So we've done a little bit of the fusion leg, if you will. The other three are a little more challenging. It's if you driving around town, you might see someone's selling firewood for $100 a truckload, or you might see the pellets sort of sitting outside the hardware store. I mean, those are both biofuels, obviously, recently derived rather than natural gas or propane, et The technology that we're developing, we're actually trying to apply at a power plant scale. And so, for example, if you look, I'm sure you even heard this morning that there's a lot of pressure on Colstrip, for example, that's due to shutter in 2022 for several reasons. One is Oregon and Washington have passed laws saying that they don't want to purchase fossil fuel derived energy anymore. You've probably also seen that the price of natural gas has really dropped quite a bit due to the fracking revolution, which itself will have a bubble. I mean, that will eventually pop. But
that's not good either.
No, there's a lot of sustainability problems associated with it. But if you also look at places like California, Germany, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, a lot of these countries, they're really pushing towards 100% renewable energy, in the very near future. So there is a big push from that. And when you have that much renewable energy on the grid, it also pushes coal out of the market. So, but that said, we still do have these plastics, these wood fibers that are building up. And so my proposal is rather than just, spending a lot of time and energy driving around curbside to curbside, picking it up to put it in a landfill, let's put that into a manufactured fuel and turn it into electricity, and then we don't have the problem. So we're yet to close a large biofuel deal, but it has to be large. And you sort of look at other countries and even continents. So right now, Western Europe buys a lot of biofuel from the southeastern U.S. So there are purpose-grown forests in southeastern U.S. that will grow, pelletize, chop and pelletize these wood fibers for use as energy overseas. We see a little bit of that in Korea, a little bit in Japan. So that's what we're aiming for on the fuel side. And then it's similar if you look at what some of these other pyrolysis outfits that will go and make biochar. A lot of times it's made as a kind of a waste byproduct, rather than just burning all the carbon and sending it into the atmosphere. Some of it will be preserved. So that's what we're aiming to do here, as well as set up a biochar facility similar to the one that my colleagues have established up in Whitefish, Montana, where algae aquaculture actually built one of the world's first carbon negative organic engines. So they were taking and it's pretty impressive. If you get a chance, you should
single source.
We should check it out. Yeah, so they built a greenhouse, and rather than
not net.
Well, it's net. So if you go and look, they're able to just with sunlight grow algae, and obviously as algae grows, it's taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and you could even imagine exhaust. And this is happening at larger scales. So you can imagine exhausting CO2 from a power plant into a big algae bubble or greenhouse, if you will, to absorb that very quickly. That algae is then taken and it's digested by bacteria, and then the carbon is still being tracked through this whole thing. The carbon comes off, and that was used to fire a retort that would basically kickstart the pyrolysis. So, and then once the pyrolysis goes, it self-sustains. But what they found, by the time the process was over, they still had extra algae left over. So in the end, they were sort of driving this sort of 3-cylinder engine, if you will, and they called it the octopus, where the algae was being collected, the buffalo, where it was being digested, and then the dragon, where the biochar was being made. So that 3-cylinder animal engine was actually right there, its own little techno bio ecosystem. So scaling that up to make sustainable pyrolytic biochar while pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, in my mind, is a big, I don't know, it'd be a good opener for the next Blade Runner. I don't know if you remember the movie from Blade Runner.
I'm thinking about the next podcast. You're going to have to hook me up with them.
All right.
They're going to need to be on the show.
Sure, okay.
So it's kind of like, it's biomimic engineering, only more bio.
Right, yeah. I mean, nature's had a long time to figure this out. So, rather than trying to reinvent it, just put it to use, especially there at that molecular scale with the algae and whatnot. So, yeah.
Why couldn't we have done that from the beginning?
Well,
that would have just been easy, right? Hindsight's 20/20.
We wake up eventually. We'll figure it out eventually. Give us a chance. Yeah. For me, if we go and say, well, I've got an iron mine over here, or a sand mine, it's pulling out silicon, or a gold mine, or a copper mine, or all, you name it. We've gone after every one of these different elements because they're in relatively high concentration, right? You're not, why would I go and dig for something in a place where it's relatively low concentration? So it's sort of the low hanging fruit, if you will. And so we'll take those molecules, those atoms, those elements, and build things out of them. So cars, refrigerators, remote controls, tables, pottery, you name it, and it's made of some type of element. Now, once it's worn out, once your TV's broken, or once your car's broken down, or once you broke your shovel handle, well, it's no longer what I would call an artifact. It's no longer something that's usable as a tool, and it's now just kind of a material. It's a TV that's made of mostly carbon in the plastic. There's some silicon in the glass. There might be some phosphorus in there, numerous precious metals. But for goodness sake, somebody went to a lot of trouble to mine those things in the first place. Yeah. And so is the best practice really just to go and put it back in a landfill and sort of jumble it up, or is it really incumbent upon us to build the next round of technologies to actually put the energy in, and I mean literally put the energy in to pull those bonds back apart and put them back into the economy? Every one of these elements has a commodity price. You can go and look and see what gold costs and copper costs and various plastics cost, and actually put those back into the economy. So that's what is incumbent upon the business person to figure out, how much energy is it going to take me to pluck apart these, the atoms, the elements from the periodic table, and put them back into the economy. So that's where an understanding of chemistry really becomes fundamental.
But so a lot of business types, sustainapreneurs, they wonder, is the technology really there? Is the innovation there? Are we at a place where this can happen? Right. With a lot of my own research, I found that it is, and it's getting better every day. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, a few things that I've seen recently, and we have in our business plan. One is to purchase, a relatively simple technology that came out of Japan, and since the invention about a decade ago, the company has named itself Blest, BLEST, and there's a kind of a little infomercial, if you will. I think it's still out there online, of a Japanese businessman sort of looking around at the garbage and the wrappers and the plastics on the ground and in the waterways. And what he did was he took the plastics, which again, getting back to chemistry, are made mainly of carbon and hydrogen, and he built a machine to take those plastics and liquefy them to the point, just like you would with a typical oil refinery. So he's liquefying these hydrocarbons back into octane, for example. So we know at room temperature, octane is liquid. So, with a little bit of innovation, a little bit of chemistry, he was able to basically, remanufacture liquid. I guess you'd call them petroleum products. I mean, somebody already went to the effort to, take the big, sticky, messy crude oil and refine it into plastic. So he's already halfway there with the refined petroleum, but now put it into something that could be used as a fuel, as a commodity, rather than tossing it off in the landfill where it's just going to make methane, for example, and pollute the atmosphere. So.
Yeah, and you're not really returning it back to nature because it's void of oxygen, so it can't really decompose or anything, and then it just creates just a lot more methane. It's just an even bigger problem piling it up. It's better to just reuse it and go through the energy of reusing it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of very impressive engineering that goes into landfills. There's a lot, there are liners and things like that, so that all of the toxins that build up and the water and the corrosion, et cetera, don't leak into the aquifer. But as we know, no technology that I've ever seen lasts forever, and there's danger of rupture. And so, as Ellen Drew says here on one of the quotes on my book, she says, eventually we will be mining our landfills, and some countries already do.
Let's hope so.
They know it's out there. So yeah, that would be the idea there, is to go back and get back to that sort of mining mentality where we know we put it in there. Let's go back and put it back into the economy.
Yeah, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to drill down to get oil, to chop the top of this mountain off to get these types of minerals, and then 10 other mountain tops to get 10 different materials when you've got every single material that you could ever need, obviously, because it's what you put in there.
Sure.
It's a direct representation of how much you use.
Right.
So we were talking before the show a little bit about energy consumption and zero waste and how they're related.
Right.
So can you go ahead and provide that for our viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. So one idea that I've had recently, and I'm hoping to do this here this summer in my own backyard, is looking at the fossil fuels that are used by garbage trucks, for example, to drive garbage around. You can probably, I don't know if you remember the 80s or even the 70s, where these giant ships were it was moving back and forth in the ocean just to move garbage around. And so rather than doing that and seeking some place to dump it, what I have envisioned lately is developing more of a pneumatic solution. So just like we have we have an electrical power grid, we have a natural gas grid, we have local sewer grids, if you will. What I am envisioning is some type of pneumatic grid. And you've probably heard of Elon Musk's Hyperloop project,
Absolutely.
Where he's going to make the vacuum tubes. We're going to shoot underground these things. If we had a sort of a smaller local version of that, where and you've probably even seen people with an in-home vacuum system, where rather than running a big clunky vacuum cleaner, they're just sort of vacuum ports in the wall. You sort of suck that away. And so in my little vision, rather than having the collection port in your house, you actually have a way of pulling that to a central unit in town. So if you can imagine, having something where, and even running it on the existing sewer grid. So, let's say you've got your paper, your plastic, what have you. If you had a grinder, just a shredder in the house, and you ground that up, and now it's in that particulate form, because that's what's going to happen to these materials anyway on their way
Right.
to the next phase of life and recycling. Grind that up and just suck them away like little dust particles, and then they go to a central facility. Now they can be processed in bulk rather than, again, getting back to that landfill use. And the nice thing about the pneumatic grid, there are some energy storage technologies out there right now where if you use, on the one hand, a pressure tank, and on the other hand, a vacuum tank, now you can actually run a gas turbine. And so integrating a pneumatic waste grid with an energy storage grid that's based on pressure, rather than chemistry or rather than hydraulics, then you kind of have an integrated solution to both of those. You've got a nice place to store energy, and I think a more sustainable, cleaner, even almost invisible way to move waste underground in pneumatic tubes. So that's kind of the way to to integrate those two problems, to reduce the fossil fuels of driving things around in trucks, but also using that pneumatic grid for vacuum and pressure to move waste around. So that's where we are.
And then.
Yeah.
And I mean, that kind of, every grid, there's waste in every kind of a grid. But
Right.
in that kind of a grid, I'm sure that there's 1,000 other things you could use in a pneumatic grid.
Oh, yeah.
I use pneumatic tools in my garage.
Oh, yeah.
And I can only imagine that I could plug in instead of having a great big tank.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'm going too far with
No,
that.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't know. I've been in the Midwest where there's some ethnic and religious groups that they're not allowed. Their religion does not allow them to use electricity, so they will use pneumatic tools. So yeah, maybe we have some customers there too.
All right. Well, let's keep it going.
All right. Thanks, Nathan.
You've got a lot of things going on, and it just sounds like you're really driving to the edge of technology and the edge of innovation. It's very impressive.
Thank you.
So before we sign off, is there anything you want to ask of our sustainapreneurs out there?
Well, no, I would like to hear from them though. As I think the whole zero waste theme really does tie in a lot of a lot of different branches of sustainability. So I can be reached via my Gmail account. It's just layton.bradley@gmail.com. layton.bradley@gmail.com. So I would love to hear from you and for ideas for the next edition of my book.
Yeah, any collaborators that want to get involved, or any if you've got any input, please give it to him. He's a very open guy.
Yeah.
So thank you, Brad, for being on the show. Be sure to check out Brad's latest book, Zero Waste in the Last Best Place. You can find it by searching for the title in Facebook, iUniverse, Amazon, and Barnes & Noble.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nathan.
Yeah, have a good one.
You too.
That concludes our episode for today. As always, thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to like, share, rate, and subscribe. And we'll see you all again next time on Sustainapreneur Podcast, where we are bridging the gap between business and sustainability.